1453, the walls of Constantinople, once thought impregnable, trembled under the might of a young sultan. With cannons roaring and armies surging, Mehmed II shattered the medieval world and proclaimed a new era. This is the story of ambition, vision, and conquest. Welcome to Mehmed II, the untold story of Constantinople's conqueror. This is the Empire of the Ink. The child who would reshape the world was born into chaos in 1432, when the Ottoman Empire stood at a crossroads between greatness and collapse. Mehmed was not born to rule unchallenged. His father, Murad II, had briefly abdicated in favor of his 12-year-old son in 1444, thrusting the boy into the treacherous waters of imperial politics, where every courtier harbored ambitions and every neighboring power sensed opportunity. The experiment lasted barely 2 years before a Janissary revolt and the invasion of Hungarian armies forced Murad's return to the throne. Those 2 years of humiliation would forge something extraordinary within young Mehmed, an iron determination never again to appear weak, never again to let others question his authority, never again to be anything less than absolute in power and vision. The education of a prince in the Ottoman court was no gentle affair of tutors and books. Mehmed's childhood unfolded in an atmosphere of calculated cruelty designed to produce rulers who could survive the Byzantine complexity of empire. He studied under the finest minds the Islamic world could provide, mastering not only Turkish and Arabic, but also Greek, Latin, Persian, and Hebrew. His library would eventually contain works of philosophy, military strategy, geography, and classical history that revealed a hunger for knowledge matched only by his hunger for conquest. The ancient heroes whose deeds he absorbed through countless hours of reading were not abstract figures from dusty manuscripts, but living presences who whispered promises of greatness if only he possessed the courage and cunning to seize what destiny offered. When Murad II died in February 1451, Mehmed ascended the throne for the second time at 19 years of age. The smooth-faced sultan who took power bore little resemblance to the boy who had been humiliated 7 years earlier. Court observers noted the penetrating intelligence in his dark eyes, the controlled intensity that marked every gesture, the way he listened more than he spoke, yet missed nothing that occurred in his presence. His first acts as sultan revealed the character that would define his reign. When whispers reached him of potential rivals among his younger brothers, Mehmed eliminated the threat with a decisiveness that shocked even the hardened veterans of Ottoman politics. The infant half-brother, drowned in his bath, sent a message that resonated throughout the empire. This sultan would tolerate no challenges, respect no sentimentality, permit no obstacles between himself and the destiny he envisioned. The European powers that surrounded the Ottoman domains initially dismissed the young sultan as inexperienced and untested. The Byzantine Empire, reduced to little more than the city of Constantinople and its immediate environs, breathed easier knowing that the militant Murad had been replaced by his scholarly son. The Italian maritime republics calculated that they could manipulate this bookish youth as they had manipulated so many Ottoman rulers before him. The Hungarian nobles, who had pushed back Ottoman advances during Murad's reign, assumed the respite would continue under his son's leadership. They were about to learn that combining intellectual sophistication with absolute ruthlessness produced something far more dangerous than either quality alone. Constantinople. The word itself carried weight that transcended geography or military value. For 11 centuries, the city founded by Constantine had stood as the eastern bastion of Christianity, the repository of Roman imperial tradition, the bridge between Europe and Asia that no conqueror had successfully crossed. The massive Theodosian walls that protected the city had turned back Avars and Persians, Arabs and Bulgars, surviving sieges that numbered in the dozens across the centuries. Every Ottoman sultan since the empire's founding had dreamed of possessing Constantinople, yet none had succeeded in breaching those legendary fortifications. The city stood as a permanent rebuke to Ottoman power, a Christian stronghold embedded in the heart of territories that now answered to the Sultan. Mehmed's obsession with Constantinople went deeper than strategic calculation or military ambition. In his mind, the conquest of the city would accomplish something that transcended mere territorial expansion. By taking Constantinople, he would become the legitimate heir to Roman imperial authority, transforming the Ottoman Sultanate from a successful but ultimately provincial power into the rightful successor to the greatest empire the world had ever known. The title of Kaiseri Rum, Caesar of Rome, was not merely honorific rhetoric, but a claim to universal sovereignty that would legitimize Ottoman rule over the diverse populations that populated the empire's expanding domains. The practical obstacles to capturing Constantinople were formidable enough to have deterred every previous Ottoman attempt. The Theodosian walls stretched for more than 3 miles, comprising multiple defensive layers, featuring massive towers, deep moats, and killing zones designed to shred any attacking force. The seaward approaches were protected by chains across the Golden Horn and fortifications that commanded every possible landing site. The city's position on a peninsula, surrounded on 3 sides by water, meant that any siege would require not only overwhelming land forces, but also naval superiority that the Ottomans had never possessed. Most dauntingly, the garrison defending Constantinople could call upon assistance from Christian Europe, particularly the maritime republics of Genoa and Venice, whose commercial interests demanded that the city remain in Christian hands. Yet where others saw insurmountable obstacles, Mehmed perceived opportunities for innovation. His years of study had taught him that the great military revolutions throughout history had come not from mere numerical superiority, but from technological and tactical innovations that rendered previous defensive systems obsolete. The development of gunpowder artillery offered possibilities that previous sieges of Constantinople had not enjoyed. Yet the cannons that existed in the early 1450s remained relatively small weapons, more useful for intimidation than actual wall breaking. What Mehmed needed was something unprecedented, a weapon so massive and powerful that the walls that had protected Constantinople for a millennium would crumble before it like sand before the tide. The arrival of Urban the Hungarian at Mehmed's court in 1452 appeared to contemporaries as nothing more than the wanderings of another mercenary engineer seeking employment. Urban was a cannon founder whose skills had first been offered to Constantine XI, the Byzantine emperor who desperately needed weapons to defend his shrinking realm. When Constantine could not afford Urban's services, the engineer made his way to Adrianople, where Mehmed held court. What followed was one of those rare moments when individual genius converges with historical necessity and unlimited resources to produce something that transforms the possible into the actual. Urban proposed to Mehmed the construction of a cannon unlike any that had ever existed, where conventional artillery of the era fired stone balls weighing perhaps 100 pounds. Urban's masterpiece would hurl projectiles weighing over half a ton. The bronze barrel would stretch more than 27 feet in length, requiring teams of oxen to transport and elaborate wooden frameworks to absorb the tremendous recoil. The technical challenges involved in casting such a weapon were immense, as any flaw in the metal would cause the cannon to explode when fired, killing its crew and destroying months of work. Yet Mehmed, recognizing that Urban offered the key to unlocking Constantinople's defenses, provided whatever resources the engineer demanded. The construction of the great cannon consumed 3 months of intensive labor at the foundries of Adrianople. When the weapon was finally completed and test-fired, the thunderous report could be heard more than 10 miles away, while the massive stone ball it launched shattered into fragments upon impact with a target wall, demonstrating the destructive potential that Urban had promised. Yet even this achievement represented only the first step in Mehmed's preparations. Urban and his team produced dozens of additional cannons of various sizes, creating an artillery train that would dwarf anything that medieval siege warfare had previously employed. The logistics of moving these weapons to Constantinople and maintaining them in operation during a prolonged siege would tax Ottoman administrative capabilities to their limits. Yet Mehmed devoted the same meticulous attention to supply arrangements that he gave to every other aspect of the coming campaign. The artillery preparations revealed the fundamental difference between Mehmed's approach to conquest and that of his predecessors. Previous Ottoman sieges had relied primarily on courage, numbers, and persistence to overcome defensive positions. Mehmed understood that courage and numbers, while necessary, were insufficient against fortifications designed by the finest military engineers of the ancient world. What he needed was overwhelming technological superiority that would render Constantinople's traditional defenses irrelevant. The Great Cannon and its smaller companions represented an investment in military innovation that would pay dividends not only at Constantinople, but in every subsequent Ottoman campaign throughout the Balkans and beyond. The construction of Rumeli Hisari, the massive fortress that Mehmed erected on the European shore of the Bosphorus directly opposite an earlier Ottoman fortress on the Asian side, demonstrated that artillery was only one component of his comprehensive strategy. Completed in a mere 4 months during 1452, Rumeli Hisari served multiple purposes that revealed Mehmed's strategic sophistication. The fortress gave Ottoman forces complete control over ship traffic through the Bosphorus, cutting Constantinople's maritime communications with the Black Sea and eliminating one potential avenue for reinforcement. The rapid construction of such a formidable fortification within sight of Constantinople's walls sent an unmistakable message about Ottoman capabilities and intentions. Most importantly, Rumeli Hisari provided a secure base from which Ottoman forces could coordinate their assault on the city while protecting their own supply lines from Byzantine naval raids. The European response to Mehmed's obvious preparations for a siege of Constantinople revealed the fundamental weakness that would ultimately doom Christian resistance. Pope Nicholas V proclaimed support for Constantinople and urged the Christian powers to send assistance, yet his calls produced more rhetoric than actual military commitment. Venice, though commercially dependent on Constantinople, calculated that maintaining good relations with the rising Ottoman power served their interests better than a potentially disastrous military confrontation. Genoa officially remained neutral, while individual Genoese captains made their own decisions about whether to aid the Byzantine defense. Hungary, still recovering from the defeats suffered during Murad's reign, offered no assistance beyond expressions of concern. The promised crusade that might have relieved Constantinople never materialized, leaving the city to face the Ottoman onslaught with only the forces that its emperor could immediately command. Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor, confronted this existential crisis with a dignity that impressed even his enemies. He understood that his empire had been reduced to a single city, that no realistic hope of relief existed, that the walls his ancestors had defended for a millennium might finally be breached by Ottoman artillery. Yet, Constantine also understood that surrender was impossible, that the symbolic importance of Constantinople demanded resistance regardless of the practical outcome, that his duty as emperor required him to fight to the last, even if defeat appeared inevitable. His preparations for the coming siege demonstrated the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized Mehmed's offensive planning. Though Constantine worked with vastly inferior resources, the garrison available to defend Constantinople numbered perhaps 7,000 men, a force laughably inadequate for manning the miles of walls that surrounded the city. Constantine's soldiers included Byzantine Greeks who remained loyal to their emperor, Genoese volunteers led by the condottiere Giovanni Giustiniani, and a handful of other foreign fighters attracted by the promise of glory or treasure. The Byzantine navy consisted of 26 ships, most of them small vessels unsuited for combat against the Ottoman fleet that Mehmed was assembling. The artillery available for the defense consisted of a few dozen small cannons that could harass attackers, but lacked the power to seriously damage Ottoman siege positions. Most dauntingly, the food stores within the city were sufficient for only a few months of siege, meaning that Constantine's strategy depended entirely upon outlasting Ottoman patience or receiving relief from Christian Europe. The spring of 1453 arrived with a sense of inevitability that gripped both besiegers and besieged. Mehmed's preparations were complete. The artillery train that departed Adrianople in March included Urban's great cannon, along with dozens of smaller pieces, transported by thousands of oxen and protected by advance forces that secured the route to Constantinople. The Ottoman army that assembled outside the city's walls numbered perhaps 80,000 men, though contemporary estimates varied wildly depending on whether the source favored Christian or Islamic perspectives. The Ottoman fleet that gathered in the Sea of Marmara included more than 100 vessels of various sizes, sufficient to establish naval superiority and prevent any chance of maritime relief for the besieged city. The formal siege of Constantinople commenced on April 6, 1453, when Ottoman forces completed their investment of the land walls and began the systematic emplacement of artillery positions. The thunder of cannon fire that echoed across the city during the following weeks announced that medieval warfare had entered a new phase, where stone walls that had protected cities for centuries could be systematically destroyed by weapons that previous generations could scarcely have imagined. The great cannon that Urban had crafted lived up to its destructive promise, though the weapon's massive recoil and the time required to reload meant it could fire only 7 shots per day. Each discharge sent a projectile weighing over half a ton crashing into the Theodosian walls, gradually creating breaches that had to be repaired each night by desperate defenders working under constant threat of Ottoman raids. The pattern of siege warfare that developed during the first weeks of the campaign revealed both Ottoman strengths and the resilience of Byzantine resistance. During daylight hours, Ottoman artillery systematically pounded sections of the wall, while miners attempted to tunnel beneath defensive positions, and sappers worked to fill the defensive moat with earth and rubble. Each night, Byzantine defenders emerged to repair the damage, rebuilding shattered sections of wall with whatever materials they could salvage, while countermining efforts attempted to collapse Ottoman tunnels. The physical and psychological strain of this continuous cycle wore down both sides. Yet Constantine's garrison demonstrated a determination that impressed even their Ottoman besiegers. The naval dimension of the siege produced one of the campaign's most dramatic episodes when Mehmed attempted to force the chain barrier that protected the Golden Horn. The Byzantine defenders had stretched a massive chain across the entrance to the harbor, preventing Ottoman ships from accessing the waters that washed against the city's northern walls. When repeated naval assaults failed to break through this barrier, Mehmed implemented a solution that demonstrated the innovative thinking that characterized his entire approach to the siege. Ottoman engineers constructed a wooden road across the hills behind the Genoese settlement of Galata, greasing the timbers to reduce friction. In a single night, Ottoman sailors hauled more than 70 ships overland and launched them into the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain barrier and threatening the city's seaward defenses. The appearance of Ottoman ships in the Golden Horn forced Constantine to divide his already inadequate garrison, stationing forces along the seaward walls that had previously been considered secure. The psychological impact of this maneuver perhaps exceeded its tactical significance, demonstrating to the defenders that no position remained safe from Ottoman ingenuity and determination. Mehmed's willingness to expend tremendous effort on what many of his advisors considered an impractical scheme revealed the complete commitment to victory that drove every aspect of the Ottoman campaign. By late May, 7 weeks of continuous siege warfare had brought both besiegers and besieged to a state of exhaustion that tested the limits of human endurance. The Ottoman artillery had created multiple breaches in the Theodosian walls, yet Byzantine defenders had managed to construct secondary barriers behind each gap, forcing any assault force to fight through multiple defensive positions. The Ottoman army had suffered thousands of casualties in preliminary assaults that tested Byzantine defenses, yet Mehmed's forces remained overwhelmingly superior in numbers and resources. Most critically, the city's food supplies were dwindling toward exhaustion, while no prospect of relief appeared on the horizon. Mehmed faced pressures of his own that made the continuation of the siege increasingly problematic. His advisors warned that a prolonged campaign would drain the treasury and potentially provoke intervention from European powers that might unite against the Ottoman threat. Reports reached the Ottoman camp of Hungarian preparations for a relief expedition that might force Mehmed to abandon the siege or face a war on multiple fronts. The great cannon that had been the centerpiece of the artillery bombardment had cracked after repeated firing, reducing the rate at which Ottoman forces could create breaches in the defenses. Most troublingly, the Janissary Corps that formed the elite corps of Ottoman infantry was growing restless, questioning whether the prize justified the mounting casualties. The decision to launch a final, overwhelming assault came from Mehmed's understanding that momentum in siege warfare could shift rapidly and unpredictably. A single successful defense might convince his army that Constantinople's walls remained impregnable, while European observers might interpret a prolonged siege as evidence of Ottoman weakness. Conversely, a successful assault would establish Ottoman military supremacy beyond question, while providing the plunder that would satisfy his soldiers and justify the campaign's enormous costs. The date selected for the assault, May 29, 1453, would become one of the most significant in world history, a moment when one era ended and another began. The final assault on Constantinople would test everything that Mehmed had built during his preparations, and everything that Constantine could summon in defense of his dying empire. The ancient city that had stood for 11 centuries, surviving countless sieges and embodying the continuity of Roman imperial tradition, would face its ultimate trial. The young sultan who had dreamed of becoming Caesar stood at the threshold of either unprecedented glory or catastrophic defeat. In the pre-dawn darkness of May 29, as Ottoman forces assembled for the assault that would determine the fate of empires, the stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through the centuries and reshape the world in ways that neither Christian nor Muslim could fully comprehend. The walls awaited. The defenders prepared. The moment that would define Mehmed's legacy and change the course of history had arrived. The darkness before dawn on May 29, 1453, carried sounds that would haunt the memories of all who heard them. The rhythmic thunder of Ottoman war drums echoed across the Marmara, accompanied by the clash of cymbals and the wailing of pipes that announced the coming assault. Thousands of voices rose in prayer and battle cries as Ottoman soldiers prepared to storm walls that had turned back every previous attempt at conquest. Inside Constantinople, the defenders heard these sounds and understood that the moment they had dreaded for 7 weeks had finally arrived. Constantine XI spent the final hours before the assault moving among his soldiers, offering words of encouragement while privately acknowledging that the empire he served would likely not survive the coming day. The Ottoman assault plan reflected Mehmed's understanding that overwhelming force applied simultaneously across multiple points would eventually shatter any defense, no matter how determined. The first wave consisted of irregulars and lesser troops whose primary purpose was to exhaust the defenders and identify weak points in the Byzantine lines. These unfortunate soldiers, driven forward by threats from their own officers, threw themselves against the walls, knowing that survival depended upon either miraculous success or reaching positions where they could shelter from Byzantine fire. Thousands died in the first hour as Greek fire, crossbow bolts, and stones hurled from the walls tore through their ranks. Yet their sacrifice served Mehmed's purpose by forcing the defenders to expend ammunition and energy before the main assault began. The second wave, composed of regular Ottoman infantry, approached the breaches that artillery had created in the Theodosian walls. Here, the fighting devolved into the brutal intimacy of hand-to-hand combat, where training and equipment counted for more than numbers. The Byzantine and Genoese defenders, positioned behind secondary barriers they had erected inside the breached sections, enjoyed significant tactical advantages that allowed smaller numbers to hold against larger forces. Giovanni Giustiniani, The Genoese condottiere, who commanded the critical sectors, demonstrated the professional military expertise that justified his reputation, coordinating defensive efforts with a skill that repeatedly threw back Ottoman assaults. For hours, the outcome remained uncertain as wave after wave of Ottoman soldiers crashed against Byzantine positions, each assault draining the strength of both attackers and defenders. The critical moment came when a small group of Ottoman soldiers discovered a postern gate, the Cercoporta, that had been left unlocked during the night's defensive preparations. Whether through accident or treachery, this minor gate provided access to the space between the inner and outer walls, allowing Ottoman forces to emerge behind the primary defensive positions. Simultaneously, Giustiniani suffered a serious wound that forced him to withdraw from the walls, creating a command crisis at precisely the moment when coordinated defense was most crucial. These convergent failures, neither individually catastrophic, yet devastating in combination, created the opportunity that Mehmed's relentless assault strategy had been designed to exploit. The breakthrough that followed was swift and terrible in its finality. Ottoman soldiers, pouring through the Cercoporta, attacked Byzantine positions from the rear, while the Janissaries, held in reserve throughout the earlier phases of the assault, launched a coordinated attack on the weakened defensive line. The psychological impact of seeing Ottoman banners planted on the inner walls proved as devastating as the tactical situation, convincing many defenders that further resistance was hopeless. The defensive cohesion that had held through 7 weeks of siege and hours of assault dissolved as individual soldiers made their own desperate calculations about whether to continue fighting, attempt escape, or seek surrender. Constantine XI faced his empire's final moment with a courage that would become legendary. Accounts of his death vary in details, but agree on essentials. The last Roman emperor died fighting in the breach, his purple imperial regalia cast aside so that he could die as a simple soldier rather than be captured and humiliated. His body was never conclusively identified among the thousands of dead that littered the walls and streets of Constantinople. Yet this very anonymity seemed appropriate for a ruler whose empire had already passed into history, even as he drew his final breath. The Byzantine Empire that had preserved Roman imperial tradition for more than 1,000 years after the fall of Rome ended not with diplomatic negotiations or dynastic marriage, but with its emperor's blood soaking into the stones of walls that could no longer protect what they had been built to preserve. The Ottoman entry into Constantinople unleashed scenes that contemporary chroniclers struggled to describe adequately. The traditional rites of conquest in siege warfare, recognized by all medieval armies, permitted soldiers who had successfully stormed a city to engage in plunder for a limited period. For 3 days, Constantinople experienced the violent transfer of wealth and power that marked the city's passage from Christian to Islamic rule. Churches were stripped of their treasures, private homes ransacked, and inhabitants who had not fled, enslaved or killed, according to the passions and calculations of individual soldiers. The scale of destruction and human suffering that accompanied these 3 days of licensed chaos represented the terrible price that conquest exacted from the conquered, a reminder that the transformation of empires involved not merely the abstract movement of borders on maps, but the concrete reality of lives destroyed and communities shattered. Yet even in the midst of conquest, Mehmed demonstrated the vision that would distinguish his reign from mere successful warfare. On the fourth day after the city's fall, he entered Constantinople in formal procession and immediately moved to establish order and assert control. The famous scene of Mehmed entering the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, and commanding that it be converted into a mosque, symbolized both continuity and transformation. The building would continue to serve as a place of worship, maintaining its spiritual significance while acknowledging the reality of new authority. The mosaics depicting Christian saints were not immediately destroyed, but covered, preserving them for potential future revelation while accommodating Islamic prohibitions on representational religious art. The days following Constantinople's conquest revealed that Mehmed's ambitions extended far beyond simple territorial acquisition. His adoption of the title Kaisari Rum, Caesar of Rome, was not mere rhetorical flourish, but a claim to imperial legitimacy that positioned the Ottoman Empire as the rightful successor to both Roman and Byzantine authority. This audacious assertion of continuity with classical imperial tradition required more than military victory to be credible. It demanded the creation of administrative, cultural, and symbolic structures that could sustain the claim that the Ottoman Empire represented not the triumph of barbarism over civilization, but the transfer of imperial authority to more capable hands. The transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul involved systematic efforts to repopulate and rebuild a city that had been declining for decades before the final siege. Mehmed issued proclamations inviting Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and other communities to return to or settle in the city, offering guarantees of religious freedom and economic opportunity that contrasted favorably with the treatment that religious minorities received in many Christian kingdoms. This policy reflected not merely pragmatic recognition that a great city required diverse population, but also the sophisticated understanding that imperial legitimacy depended upon demonstrating the capacity to rule over diverse subjects more effectively than previous regimes. The architectural transformations that Mehmed initiated in Istanbul announced his vision of creating a capital worthy of universal empire. The construction of the Topkapi Palace established a royal residence that combined Ottoman architectural traditions with elements borrowed from Byzantine and Persian imperial styles. The palace complex, designed to house not merely the Sultan and his family, but also the elaborate administrative apparatus required to govern a vast empire, represented a statement about the permanence and sophistication of Ottoman rule. The location chosen for the palace, overlooking both the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn, provided symbolic connection to Constantinople's imperial past, while asserting Ottoman mastery over the strategic waterways that connected Europe and Asia. The patron-client networks that Mehmed established with Greek, Armenian, and Jewish community leaders revealed his understanding that effective empire required cooperation from existing social structures rather than their complete replacement. The appointment of Gennadius Scholarius as Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople sent a clear message that Christian religious institutions would be preserved and protected under Ottoman rule, albeit in subordinate relationship to Islamic authority. Similar arrangements with Armenian and Jewish leaders created a system where religious communities maintained internal autonomy in exchange for political loyalty and tax payments. This millet system, as it came to be known, provided a practical solution to the challenge of governing religiously diverse populations while maintaining Islamic supremacy. The conquest of Constantinople represented the crowning achievement of Mehmed's reign. Yet for the young sultan, it marked not an ending, but a beginning. The remaining 28 years of his life witnessed continuous military campaigns that expanded Ottoman territory across the Balkans, around the Black Sea, and into Anatolia. The Siege of Belgrade in 1456, though ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated Ottoman capabilities at projecting power deep into Christian Europe. The conquest of the remaining Byzantine territories in the Peloponnese, the submission of the Crimean Khanate, and the systematic reduction of independent principalities in Anatolia revealed the relentless energy that drove Ottoman expansion under Mehmed's leadership. The wars against Venice and Genoa that characterized the later years of Mehmed's reign showed his determination to establish Ottoman naval power as the dominant force in the eastern Mediterranean. The capture of Negroponte in 1470 eliminated the primary Venetian naval base in the Aegean, while Ottoman raids along the coast of Italy itself demonstrated that no Christian territory could consider itself secure from Islamic power. The brief Ottoman occupation of Otranto in southern Italy in 1480 sent shockwaves through Christian Europe, raising the terrifying prospect that Rome itself might fall to the Ottomans as Constantinople had fallen a generation earlier. Yet Mehmed's legacy extended beyond military conquest to encompass cultural and intellectual achievements that transformed Istanbul into one of the great centers of learning and artistic production. His court attracted scholars, artists, and intellectuals from across the Islamic world and beyond, creating an environment where Greek philosophy, Persian poetry, and Islamic theology engaged in dialogue that enriched all participants. The famous portrait of Mehmed by the Italian painter Gentile Bellini captured the Sultan's dual nature: the warrior conqueror who had destroyed the Byzantine Empire, and the sophisticated patron who appreciated Renaissance art and classical learning. The administrative reforms that Mehmed implemented created governmental structures capable of managing an empire that spanned 3 continents and incorporated dozens of distinct ethnic and religious communities. The development of the Devshirme system, which recruited Christian boys for conversion to Islam and training for government service, provided the Ottoman state with administrators whose loyalty derived from direct dependence on the Sultan, rather than competing aristocratic or tribal allegiances. The elaboration of legal codes that synthesized Islamic law with customary practices from conquered territories created frameworks for governance that could adapt to local conditions while maintaining central authority. The darker aspects of Mehmed's character and reign cannot be ignored in any honest assessment of his legacy. The ruthlessness he displayed toward potential rivals within his own family established a pattern of fratricide that would haunt Ottoman succession for generations. The violence that accompanied his conquests, while not exceptional by the standards of medieval warfare, involved suffering on scales that contemporary witnesses found shocking. The displacement of populations, the enslavement of conquered peoples, and the systematic exploitation of subject territories revealed the harsh realities that underlay the grand rhetoric of universal empire. The execution of Grand Vizier Chandarli Halil Pasha following the conquest of Constantinople demonstrated that even the highest officials remained subject to Mehmed's absolute authority. Chandarli Halil had opposed the siege of Constantinople as too risky and expensive, and his execution served as a reminder that disagreement with the Sultan's vision could prove fatal, regardless of past service or current rank. This incident, along with numerous similar examples throughout Mehmed's reign, revealed the personal nature of Ottoman absolutism and the constant precarity that characterized service at the highest levels of government. The cultural destruction that accompanied Ottoman expansion represented losses that cannot be quantified in purely material terms. The libraries of Constantinople that were scattered or destroyed during the conquest contained manuscripts that preserved classical learning and Byzantine scholarship. While some of this material survived through various channels, much was lost forever, representing a permanent diminishment of humanity's intellectual heritage. The conversion of churches into mosques, while preserving the buildings themselves, transformed their meaning and severed connections to the communities that had created and sustained them across centuries. Mehmed's death on May 3, 1481, at the age of 49, came while he was preparing yet another campaign, this time directed against either Rhodes or possibly Italy. The circumstances of his death remain somewhat mysterious, with contemporary sources suggesting possibilities ranging from natural causes to poison administered by rivals who feared his relentless ambition. The fact that he died while planning further conquests seemed appropriate for a ruler whose entire reign had been characterized by ceaseless activity and boundless ambition. Even in death, Mehmed generated controversy and conflict, as the succession struggle between his sons Bayezid and Cem threatened to plunge the empire into civil war. The funeral of Mehmed the Conqueror occasioned displays of mourning that reflected both genuine grief and calculated political theater. The procession that carried his body through Istanbul to its final resting place at the Fatih Mosque passed through a city that had been utterly transformed during his reign. The population that lined the route to pay respects included Greeks and Turks, Christians and Muslims, free citizens and slaves, all of whom understood that they were witnessing the end of an era that had reshaped their world. The tomb that housed Mehmed's remains became a site of pilgrimage for those who admired his achievements, while also serving as a reminder of the mortality that limits even the greatest conquerors. Bayezid II, who ultimately secured power, adopted policies that contrasted sharply with his father's aggressive expansionism, focusing more on consolidation and internal development than dramatic new conquests. Yet this shift in approach could not erase the fundamental transformations that Mehmed had accomplished during his 30-year reign. The Ottoman Empire that Bayezid inherited was a fundamentally different entity from the state that Mehmed had assumed in 1541, possessing territorial extent, administrative sophistication, and international prestige that made it one of the great powers of the age. A legacy of Mehmed the Conqueror remains contested terrain where different narratives compete for dominance. To Turkish historians and much of the Islamic world, Mehmed represents the archetypal great sultan whose vision, courage, and military genius elevated the Ottoman Empire to the first rank of world powers. The conquest of Constantinople stands as one of history's decisive moments, a triumph that avenged centuries of crusades and established Islamic power in the heart of what had been Christian territory. The transformation of Istanbul into a great Islamic city, the expansion of Ottoman domains across multiple continents, and the creation of imperial institutions that would sustain Ottoman power for centuries all testify to achievements that few rulers in history can match. To Greek historians and much of the Christian world, Mehmed embodies the catastrophe that destroyed the last remnant of Roman imperial continuity and subjected Christian populations to centuries of Islamic rule. The fall of Constantinople represented not merely a military defeat, but a cultural and religious tragedy whose reverberations extended far beyond the immediate victims. The loss of Byzantine scholarship, the transformation of ancient churches into mosques, and the long night of Ottoman rule over Balkan Christian populations created wounds that remained unhealed for centuries. The fact that Mehmed combined military conquest with systematic efforts to legitimize Ottoman rule through cultural and administrative achievements makes him more rather than less problematic from this perspective, as his successes made Ottoman dominance more durable and more difficult to reverse. To modern historians attempting to assess Mehmed's significance beyond partisan narratives, the challenge lies in recognizing both the extraordinary nature of his achievements and the terrible costs they imposed on those who stood in his path. The conquest of Constantinople was genuinely a world historical event, one of those rare moments when the trajectory of entire civilizations shifts decisively. Mehmed's vision of creating a universal empire that could claim legitimate succession from Rome represented sophisticated political thinking that transcended mere military opportunism. His patronage of learning and the arts, his willingness to employ talented individuals regardless of religious background, and his construction of governmental institutions that could manage diverse populations all demonstrate capabilities that extended well beyond those of a successful warlord. Yet these achievements cannot be separated from the methods through which they were accomplished or the suffering they entailed. The siege of Constantinople involved violence on scales that shocked even hardened medieval observers. The slavery, displacement, and cultural destruction that accompanied Ottoman expansion represented real human costs that moral accounting cannot simply ignore or rationalize through historical context. The absolutism that Mehmed embodied and institutionalized created a political culture where individual lives counted for nothing against imperial ambitions, where dissent invited destruction, and where power acknowledged no limits except those imposed by practical constraints. What makes Mehmed II enduringly fascinating is not merely the scale of his achievements, but the questions his life raises about the relationship between individual ambition and historical transformation. To what extent was the fall of Constantinople inevitable, a delayed consequence of Byzantine decline that any capable Ottoman sultan would eventually have accomplished? How much did Mehmed's particular combination of military skill, strategic vision, and ruthless determination matter in determining not merely that Constantinople would fall, but when and how, and with what consequences? These questions have no definitive answers, yet wrestling with them illuminates the complex interplay between individual agency and structural forces that shapes historical outcomes. The comparison that contemporaries and later historians have often drawn between Mehmed and Alexander the Great reveals both illuminating parallels and significant differences. Both achieved conquest on scales that transformed their known worlds. Both died relatively young while planning further expeditions. And both combined military genius with cultural sophistication in ways that transcended simple generalizations about conquerors. Yet where Alexander's empire fragmented immediately upon his death, leaving behind primarily cultural legacies through Hellenization, Mehmed's Ottoman Empire endured for more than 4 centuries after his death, shaping the political geography of 3 continents through institutional structures that proved remarkably durable. The question of what Mehmed might have accomplished had he lived longer remains one of history's intriguing counterfactuals. His death at 49, while planning further campaigns, suggests that his ambitions remained unfulfilled and possibly unfulfillable. The conquest of Italy, that some sources suggest he was planning, would have fundamentally altered European history, potentially preventing the Renaissance from achieving its full flowering while establishing Ottoman power in the heartland of Western Christianity. The fact that such scenarios remained unrealized leaves us with a Mehmed whose achievements, however extraordinary, represent incomplete fulfillment of visions that might have reshaped the world even more dramatically. The final assessment of Mehmed the Conqueror must acknowledge that he represents one of those rare historical figures whose actions genuinely altered the trajectory of world history. The fall of Constantinople stands as one of the great symbolic markers separating medieval from modern history, one of those events whose significance contemporaries immediately recognized and whose implications continued to unfold across subsequent centuries. Mehmed's achievement in conquering the city went beyond military success to encompass the systematic construction of imperial structures, cultural institutions, and symbolic frameworks that could sustain Ottoman power across diverse populations and vast territories. The transformation of Istanbul from the dying capital of a moribund empire into the vibrant center of a rising world power represented not merely conquest, but genuine rebirth. The city that Mehmed created combined elements from Byzantine, Islamic, and Ottoman traditions into a unique synthesis that would influence architectural, artistic, and intellectual developments throughout the early modern period. The policies of religious tolerance and cultural patronage that Mehmed implemented, while serving practical purposes of imperial governance, also created spaces where different traditions could engage in productive dialogue that enriched all participants. Yet the costs of empire building cannot be forgotten or romanticized through historical distance. The people who died on Constantinople's walls, the families torn apart by slavery, the communities displaced by conquest, the cultural treasures destroyed by warfare, all represent real losses that moral accounting must acknowledge, even while recognizing the historical significance of Mehmed's achievements. The fact that his methods were typical of his age does not make them less terrible, nor does the grandeur of his vision excuse the suffering required to realize it. Mehmed II stands before history as a figure of genuine greatness whose achievements came at terrible costs, a visionary whose dreams reshaped the world while destroying the worlds of countless individuals whose names we will never know. He was the conqueror who captured a city that had resisted conquest for 11 centuries, the administrator who built institutions that sustained empire for 4 centuries, the patron who fostered learning and arts that enriched civilization, and the despot whose absolute power acknowledged no limits beyond those imposed by death itself. Understanding Mehmed requires holding all these aspects simultaneously, resisting the temptation to reduce complex historical reality to simple moral judgments that satisfy contemporary sensibilities, but fail to capture the genuine ambiguity of human achievement purchased through human suffering. The young prince who humiliated in his first attempt at rule became the Caesar who conquered Rome's successor and transformed the political map of 3 continents. In that journey, from failure to unprecedented success, Mehmed demonstrated qualities that historians of every perspective must acknowledge: strategic vision, tactical brilliance, administrative sophistication, cultural patronage, and the kind of relentless determination that shapes history rather than merely experiencing it. Whether one judges his legacy as triumphant achievement or catastrophic conquest depends largely on perspective, yet the magnitude of his impact on world history remains undeniable, regardless of moral assessment. The Sultan, who entered the Hagia Sophia on May 29, 1453, and ordered its conversion into a mosque, was doing more than celebrating military victory. He was announcing the birth of a new era, the transfer of imperial authority from one civilization to another, the beginning of Ottoman predominance that would shape southeastern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean for centuries to come. In that single symbolic act, Mehmed embodied the transformation of the world that his ambition and ability had accomplished. The death of one age and the birth of another. The endless human cycle of rise and fall that makes history something more than mere chronicle of events. Mehmed the Conqueror died as he had lived, restless with ambition and unsatisfied by achievements that would have crowned any other life with glory. Yet in his restless incompleteness lies perhaps his most profound legacy, the demonstration that human ambition, when combined with sufficient will and capability, can indeed reshape reality, can transform what seemed permanent into memory, can create new worlds from the ruins of old ones. For good and for ill, for glory and for suffering, Mehmed changed history. That fact alone places him among the small number of individuals whose lives genuinely matter to understanding how our world came to be. From the fall of Constantinople to the birth of an empire, Mehmed II proved that history is written by those bold enough to reshape it. His legacy endures in stone, in faith, and in the echoes of empire. If this journey inspired you, subscribe and join us as we continue to uncover the leaders and legends who changed the world. Thank you for watching, and welcome to the Empire.